Welcome to the Building a Better Colorado Fiscal Webinar Series. We're going to be discussing Colorado's state budget and our aging population. We appreciate everybody joining today. We are going to try and keep this to an hour, and we're going to try and manage what you see so it syncs with what you're hearing. I'm Reeves Brown, and I'll be moderating the session today, and also have with me today Brian Taylor, who is going to be helping keep us in line and follow along. Hello, Brian. How are you doing? We're using these nifty headsets for our benefit and yours, so you can hear and cut down the background noise, and they also make us look like really cool Jedi X-Wing fighter pilots. Be patient with us as we're adjusting back and forth between our presenters and their presentations. Want to point out a couple of aspects of the webinar. You all will be able to hear and see the webinar, but you won't be able to talk. But you can communicate with us using the chat button on your control panel. There at the bottom of your control panel on the right. If you have questions that you would like to pose to either of our presenters, we would encourage you to send those at any time during their presentation, and then at the conclusion of the hour, we'll try and get to as many of those questions as we can. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's an option to submit questions. So if you have any questions about the process or how to participate, just hit that chat button, and Brian will be able to respond to that. We're going to be recording this webinar and posting it on our website, Building a Better Colorado. Okay, so the agenda that we're going to be using, we're going to talk a little bit about who Building a Better Colorado is. It's a shameless self-promotion that you have to endure. We'll introduce our two presenters. We have a poll that we're going to launch to give our audience a chance to tell us a little bit about themselves. We'll hear a presentation from Elizabeth Garner, presentation from Natalie Mullis, and then we'll cover the Q&A session. So, our first presenter will be Elizabeth Garner. Elizabeth is the state demographer with the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, an agency focused on strengthening the capacity of Colorado's communities and local governments. She leads the State Demography Office, which produces population and economic estimates and forecasts for use by state agencies and local governments. Elizabeth has over 25 years of experience analyzing population and economic trends in the state, and her current areas of research include aging in Colorado, characteristics of migration, and poverty. Elizabeth is an economist and received her BA in business at the University of San Diego, her master's in agricultural and resource economics at Colorado State University. She's a Colorado native, something only 43% of the state's population can claim. So, can you bring up Elizabeth? And hello, Elizabeth. How are you doing? And can you give her
hello
screen? Pull up her.
All right, over there. Can you see it? Yay.
There we are. There you are. And let's see. Is there a way to make her screen full size? There. Okay, Elizabeth, I think you have the con.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this program. Talking about aging in Colorado. So what's really important to understand is really how relatively new this is for Colorado, and that it is also very different across the state. Not every area is aging the same. And maybe most importantly is that when we're talking about aging in context to kind of the state budget, is that it's not just cut and dry. It's not just one area where we're going to see these changes, that we're going to see changes due to industry, where people spend their dollars, incomes, labor force, housing, where people make their expenditures, and then ultimately what we're also seeing is a slowing down in population growth, which then also impacts the state budget. In order to really get it and understand it, I think it's important to understand where the state is as a whole in terms of growth and what's going on in terms of the United States. So the U.S. is still growing. Therefore, Colorado is also still getting a part of that growth. The U.S. is increasing by about 2.3 million people a year, or about 0.7% annually. Colorado is at about 5.6 million people a year, or it is at 5.6 million. It's ranked 9th fastest in terms of population growth at 1.4%. But what's important to know is that this is actually a slowdown in our recent growth. The year before we were 7th. The year before that we were 2nd. So we are slowing down relative to some other states. Also 8th in terms of total growth, increasing by 77,000 this last year. The year before that, it was about 90,000. The year before that, it was about 99,000. So again, we're also slowing down in our growth across the United States relative to some other states. But maybe most importantly is to understand that this growth is also changes within the state as a whole. And if we look at the map of the state, just the changes in population since 2010, we can see growth. Red, orange, yellow are counties that have increased in population, and shades of blue are counties that have declined in population. So even though we've increased by over kind of 568,000 people in this time frame, there are some counties, about 20 of them, that have declined in population. So this growth that we've seen has been relatively centralized along the Front Range, and actually aging has something to do with this. The fact that we've got some older counties around especially the southeast corner of the state, but the eastern plains especially, has led to some of that population decline. If we look at total population change in the state, what's important to understand is it comes from two totally different components. One is called natural increase, which is the births minus deaths, and that's represented by the blue component. You can see it stayed relatively smooth over the history starting from 1970, but what you've seen is that recently that it has had a downturn or a slowing in that natural increase, meaning that that component coming from births is starting to slow down. So again, that the blue component is births minus deaths. So we've seen that slowing down. The red component is natural increase, and this, or is net migration. This is the piece that I find really interesting to look at because a lot of people are talking about the recent growth and unprecedented recent growth. And when you look at it and you see that basically we're at, we've been at this, 77,000, and recently not a huge component of change compared to, like, if you look at the 1990s, we had 7 years where we increased by over 100,000, 1 year in the 1970s where we increased by over 100,000, but since 2001, we haven't increased by over that 100,000 mark, and that really has some things to do with the aging of our population in terms of slowing down the economy as well. Most boring chart I know that you've ever seen, but I wanted to show you real quickly. The red line is our deaths, and we can see the steady increase in deaths across the state. Again, that has to do with our age distribution, that we're starting to see a larger share in our population that have higher tendencies of dying. And then we're also seeing this slowing down in births. And one of the key things I look at when we see this slowing down in births, and this does tie into the state budget, is that, oh my goodness, where are our workers 20 years from now? And I know that's a horrible way to think about a baby, but it's big picture, long run is what we're looking at, and who is going to be our future labor force. So if we take those two pieces and we look at our births and deaths, we get our concept of natural increase. And again, the red, orange, yellow counties are counties that have had positive natural increase, but those shades of blue are counties, and it may be not easy to see, but shades of blue plus kind of a whitish color, and there's 16 of them are in the phase of natural decline, which means that we've got several counties, and again, down in the southeast especially, that are in this phase of natural decline where we've got more deaths than births. So again, when we're looking at a public finance or a state budget concept, when areas of the state are in natural decline, some of the first things that you should be asking yourself are, how are these communities going to continue to fund themselves? Because they are starting to lose population. There's fewer people to pay for the roads, the bridges, the schools, the infrastructure that you might see in a community. So let's talk about age and how did we get where we are. So when we migrate people to Colorado, what's important to understand is that we typically migrate young adults. Age is along the horizontal axis in this graph. And our bread and butter population that we migrate are kind of those 22 to 37-year-olds. And our first big group of net migrants to the state were in the 1970s, and they just happened to be baby boomers at that time. Colorado is growing a great deal of jobs during that time frame, and so it had attracted a lot of young adults, and there were a lot of baby boomers in that group. We don't get a lot of folks over the age of 65. The red line is at 65. It's about a net zero in that time frame. There's a little bit of movement, but again, it's not a huge component of our natural increase. Our net migration, but it's important to see that spectrum of who do we typically attract and why do they come here. They come here typically related to jobs, and that's an important understanding. The blue bars are net job growth. The red line is net migration. So when we see a lot of job growth, like we saw in the 90s, we needed to bring in people to fill those jobs. Again, as we can see during the recession in the 2000s, we saw a lot less job growth, and in some specific years, job decline, and we saw that steep slowdown in net migration. If you look at our forecast, one of the interesting things to look at is that we are actually forecasting a slowdown in our job growth, which again is the blue bar, and we're also forecasting a slowdown in our net migration, which is the red line, but you'll see that that red line is actually above the job growth. So we're forecasting more migration than job growth, and this is related to aging because our labor force is going to be so impacted by the number of leavers from the labor force that we're actually going to need more people coming into the state to fill the jobs that they're going to be vacating, as well as filling any new jobs the state may grow. And I'm going to take a little bit of time on this graph to kind of explain its relevance. But to understand the aging in Colorado over time, I think it's important to see where we've been. And if we look at the red part of this graph, this is the age distribution of Colorado in 1990. And you can find yourself on this graph. So for example, for me, in 1990, I was about 25 years old. So I think I can get I got my little cursor right around 25. And so there I am in 1990. And in front of me, the folks older than me, there were a lot more of them. Those were those baby boomers that had moved into the state during the 80s and a little bit in the 70s as well. They moved into the state, and they were in those age groups in front of me. Then the yellow or the orange component that's after that, this is 2010. This is where we were in 2010. And a couple of things I want you to notice. So, you know, if I can find myself then 20 years later, then I was 45. So then here I am again. I'm in this trough. I was part of what they call the baby bust. And so after the baby boom, there was a baby bust. But if you look at our age distribution in 2010, you can see that it was actually fairly uniform, except for a couple of these little busts that we've seen in here, across all ages from about 55 to the youngest ages, compared to where you see us in 1990, we had a significant trough after our baby boomers. This is important to see because between 1990 and 2010, what was the fastest or the largest growing age group? It was these 45 to 64-year-olds. And you can start thinking to yourself, what is significant about 45 to 64? Well, they're your highest earning, highest pay, property tax paying, highest spending age group of all ages that we've got. And that was one of our fastest growing age groups. Our second fastest growing age group was these kind of young adults, those that were migrating in. Very little growth in that 65 plus, which is to the right side of the black line. Now let's go forward another 20 years between the orange and this light blue. Where do we see a lot of growth? We saw a lot of growth to the right side of that black line, which is our aging population, so that's the 65 plus. We see a lot of growth also in kind of the young adults. These are the millennials aging forward, but very little growth in the 45 to 64-year-olds. So again, we can start understanding with this context of age into public finance when we think about our highest spending, highest earning, highest property tax paying are at the slowest growing of that time period. Also, we can see in the young adults and the kiddos, a slowdown in the kids as well. And so again, it's unfortunate as I think of them as future workers, but that is a slowdown that we need to be thinking about, is who will be filling these jobs in another 40 years from now, when these guys, well, actually even the 20 to 30 years, when these guys are aging into markets that the millennials will end up leaving. So, but what's important to know is that not every county is the same. And I know we're talking about the state as a whole, but this is Park, and it is a relatively old county. And so it's dealing with different issues than, let's say, Denver, that has a different age distribution, very young, not dealing with a lot of the aging impacts, because it really is very much concentrated in that 30-year-old population, a lot of millennials. So it's important to understand that across the state, everybody's dealing with a different basket of goods. And when we look at aging for the 65 plus, just in this 10-year time frame between 2015 and 2025, where are we forecasting the biggest changes? Well, it's the darkest colored counties. It's the counties that we could see Park, Eagle, Grand, and Elbert are all forecast to have the largest percentage growth in their 65 plus population. The light colored counties on the Eastern Plains are those that are expecting the least amount of impact or the lowest percentage change. And in fact, some of the counties are actually going to get a little younger because they're going to have fewer people that are in those older age groups in that Eastern Plains. So it's, again, every part of the state is going to be experiencing a different component because of the aging in Colorado. So what do we think are some of the biggest components and the biggest impacts, and especially as related to public finances? One, first, it's just a big numbers issue. We're going to be increasing the 65 plus population by about 72% just in this 15-year time frame between 2015 and 2030, or from about 711,000 to 1.2 million people. Now, if we think about folks over the age of 65, or even you can start even as early as 55, people start spending their dollars differently. And so that's creating different jobs and a different occupational mix. A lot of the older generation tends to also spend their dollars in healthcare and eating out. And that's important to think about, because what are the kinds of jobs and wages that those jobs create? And that ties into the public finance system, because different jobs pay different wages, which will then be taxed differently as they contribute into the economy. Also really important to look at it in terms of the labor force, which I will hit a little bit more in depth in a couple more slides, because there's going to be a lot of leavers from the labor force or retirees. Also, as well as housing. It's important to understand the impact on housing. There's more homeowners that are actually in these older age groups, but they also move less frequently. So some of the stickiness that we've seen in the housing market actually has more to do with the aging of our population and their less likelihood of actually moving and freeing up that housing unit. There's also been an increase in health and disability concerns, as well as people use transportation services differently. Natalie is going to go into a great detail on the impact on incomes and public finance, but both a significant downward pressure due to this aging population. And just to really get a better feel of this aging population, I wanted to just show this graph of the 65 plus over time. And we can see in 2000 at about 400,000, ending up in 2030 at about 1.3 million. And that's a significant change in what we're seeing in terms of the total numbers. And just for comparison, between 2000 and 2008, we saw about 100,000 increase in our population 65 plus. Between 2008 and 2012, so a 4-year time period, the next 100,000. Between 2012 and 2015, so only 3 years, another 100,000. Between 2015 and 2018, another 100,000. And we're forecasting that it will actually be about 2.5 years that we'll see the next increase in that 100,000, all the way until about 2026, well, we'll start to see that slow down. So if we look at the age distribution, it's really important to see that, yes, the 25 to 44-year-olds will be still our largest share of the total population, but our fastest growth will be in that 65 plus, increasing by 77%, And then we've got that kind of baby bust group that's in, or the Gen X, in that 45 to 64, so only increasing by 13%. We've got then the 25% and the 25 to 44-year-olds, but then even slower for then the under 24-year-old population, just between 2015 and 2030. As I had mentioned before, huge impact on employment and types of jobs. We can see health services was the #1 gainer in employment since pre-recession peak, which was in 2008. So largest growth in health services, and then if you look fourth one down, accommodations and food service, completely driven by the aging in population that we've seen in this time frame. And that's what we're seeing, and it's important to think about what are those jobs. So we've got the doctors, but then we've also got the home health aides, and then we've got that significant population in accommodations and food service, all making below average weekly wage rates in terms of their salaries. So this will start to put some downward pressure on incomes in the state just due to the jobs that we're creating because of the aging in Colorado. Also an impact on the labor force in terms of aging, and is one of the reasons why our labor market has been so tight, has been to the fact that we've got this much larger share of retirees leaving the labor force. And just for an example, boomers are about 37% of the total labor force, or at least they were in 2010. Yes, a lot of them are staying in the labor force longer, and it's actually been the fastest increase in labor force participation rates have been in the 65 plus, but eventually people age out. They may be in there until 65, maybe until 70, 75 maybe, but then everybody starts aging out, and really we'll start to see, you know, there's going to be about 1 million workers aging out of our labor force over these next 20 years, and those require people to take their jobs. Likewise, if I retire, I'm also going to be spending and generating jobs just from my being here, but not necessarily working. Demands will definitely vary by industry. Our oldest aged industries are education, health, utilities, and mining. And so these are the industries that are having the hardest time finding additional people to work in those industries because they're having a lot faster turnover. Likewise, there's a lot of people, especially in the 45 to 64-year-old age group, that are leaving the labor force to end up caring for a family or friend that is aging. This gives you a little bit of the picture of that squeezing in the labor force. We've got the retirees in red, the entrants in the blue, and this is just a depiction of people coming in that you've got these, back in 1990, you had about 20,000 retirees and about 50,000 entrants. So you had about a surplus of 30,000 that could take up jobs. Well, where we are in 2018 right now, there's only about a 5,000 to 10,000 wiggle room in it, but we're still creating 50,000 plus jobs a year. So this is putting a squeeze on our labor force, requiring those positions. We won't really feel this tending to soften until after about 2030. Just to give another example of this, this is looking at the age dependency ratio. To understand it, think about it, in 1970, for every 100 workers, there were about 75 non-workers. We get to the point in 2010, which I call nirvana, definitely from a public finance point of view, for every 100 workers, there were about 55 non-workers. And you can see it split up by the under 18, which is in the blue, and the over 65, which is in the red. Now we're moving up to a point where by 2040, we're forecasting this to be for every 100 workers, there will be about 70 non-workers. So again, looking at that impact of the aging in Colorado, a much larger share in that 65 plus. Natalie's going to go into these, and she has much cooler charts, so I'm not going to spend any time on this, but it's important to understand that people spend differently by age group, and we're seeing slower growth in the 45 to 64-year-olds and faster growth in the 65 plus, which is again putting some downward pressure on expenditures in the state. So how are we forecasting the state ultimately? We're forecasting to increase from our 5.6 million currently to about 8.5 million by 2050. You can see how that's distributed by the under 65 and over 65 population. The important thing to see here is that we're slowing down, and especially the under 65 population growth is slowing down. Even though that's a lot of people, that is a slower rate. We're increasing, so in 1990 it was about 9%, 65 plus, increasing to about 19% in 2050. So there will be some big changes in terms of the share of our total population by different ages. So just to summarize, in big picture, this is an important deal to look at because we really haven't been this place before with this aging population. We've had a nice large population in the working age population since about 1970, so for the last 40 years. Not a lot of people over the age of 65, and we're still, even with this aging, we're going to be younger than the US average, primarily because we migrate young adults to the state. Largest impacts will be along the Front Range. As I'd mentioned before, there's implications across the economy, labor force, housing, transportation, healthcare, public finance. We're forecasting that migration of the 65 plus to stay about zero, but that could change. We could keep more, we could lose more, or it could be about this at that zero. So with that, thank you very much, and I think we'll be turning it over to Natalie.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We appreciate that. And Brian, can you turn control over my screen? Yes. Okay. I wanted to do a quick review of Building Better Colorado. I wasn't able to pull this up earlier, and I believe you can see this now. This is our Building Better Colorado website, and I just wanted to introduce who BBCO was. BBCO was started in 2015. It's a nonpartisan effort to host a statewide conversation. Is that up? Now we're good? Okay. It wasn't up before. Okay. So nonpartisan statewide effort to host a conversation about statewide policies. BBCO doesn't advocate for any particular policy or any particular policy outcome. We only advocate for a nonpartisan, intelligent conversation amongst Coloradans. Our process is to engage people online this year through webinars such as we're doing and through social media with the intent that next year we'll be hosting 37 meetings across the state to engage community leaders. The Building Better Colorado is run by an executive committee that is politically balanced, and we greatly appreciate the time that they commit to this. If you would like to be considered to participate in one of our community meetings next year, you can click on the Participate tab here and have the opportunity to sign up. The meetings that we host are not open to the public. They are specific lists that are built by community leaders to reflect the diversity of their community to ensure that we have a balanced conversation. So I encourage you to do that, to go to the website and sign up so that you can be on that list to be considered. The issues page is where the meat of our material lies. We'll be posting up information on all of these topics. Today we're talking about the state budget, and you can see on that page much of the material or some of the material that we're covering today. Finally, the one thing I wanted to mention, we have an FAQ screen on here that answers some basic questions about building a better Colorado, including how we get our funding. And I just wanted to give a shout out to the groups that fund Building a Better Colorado. As a nonpartisan organization that doesn't advocate for any outcomes, it truly needs to be funded by the benevolent community that doesn't have a specific interest in any outcome other than a fair conversation. And so we're grateful to organizations like the Gates Family Foundation, Piton Foundation, Anschutz Foundation, Caring for Colorado, the Buell Foundation, and the Bohemian Foundation, as well as a handful of individual donors for supporting this effort. So with that, I want to invite Natalie to join us. Let's see if I can pull her up. And Natalie, you should be getting control of the screen here. Let me introduce Natalie real quick while she's pulling up. Natalie is the fiscal director for the Legislative Council staff. She oversees the fiscal notes and economic staff of the Colorado General Assembly. Natalie served as the legislature's chief economist between 2009 and 2017 and has been a member of the legislature staff since November of '98. Natalie received both her master's and bachelor's summa cum laude in economics from the University of Colorado at Boulder. The fiscal staff are responsible for analyzing the fiscal impacts of legislative bills, forecasting the Colorado economy and state government revenue, analyzing school finance funding, and educating legislators and the public about the state budget and fiscal policy in the state constitution. And I want to remind everybody again to please turn any questions that you have, go ahead and type those in on your screen, and we will get to those as soon as Natalie is done with her presentation. Thank you, Natalie, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So what does AG mean for state budgets? There is a bottom line. And the bottom line is that revenue, state revenue and local government revenue, by the way, are going to continue to grow, but revenue is not going to grow as fast as it would have otherwise. Per capita revenue, that's per person revenue, is going to fall, all else equal. In the meantime, budget pressures will grow faster than they did before because we have a rising demand for state services from the older population, and we also have an aging infrastructure. Population growth is going to be a fairly small impact every year, but it's going to get bigger every year, and it's going to have a significant, it's something that the state budget writers have already been feeling. To put things into context, I'm going to start with some slides that just show you the overall state budget as a whole and talk about where the money comes from and where the money is spent. And then I'll talk about how aging affects revenue to the state budget, and then talk about how it affects state expenditures before putting it all together for you at the end. So just a warning, the next slide is going to look kind of like maybe my grandmother's Afghan at first, but it really does have some real information in it. So after your first reaction to it, hopefully it will be something that can help. This is the state budget in a big picture format. If anyone's familiar with the Sankey diagram, that's what this is. It shows you on your left, and those boxes, the blue box that says general fund, cash funds, federal funds, and then reappropriated, where the money comes from for the entire state budget. We're not focusing just on the general fund, but the entire thing now for FY 17-18, so this is still a forecast. A little bit more than a third is general fund. And then we have cash funds. Those are earmarked funds that has sources of revenue like the gasoline tax that's earmarked. Like gasoline tax is earmarked for transportation. Of course, money from the federal government, and just so you're not hanging out there wondering what reappropriated is, that's money that is spent between departments. So for example, the legislature has appropriated a general fund dollar, and they need to use that to pay for legal services from the Department of Law that is again appropriated as to the Department of Law. So it's appropriated general fund first and reappropriated to the Department of Law. On your right, you can see spending by department, and the Afghan part of it is how that money flows, where cash fund money goes, where general fund money goes, and how those departments are all funded. And you can see that over half of the total budget is spent on kindergarten through 12th grade education and healthcare, with healthcare being the biggest pot there. And the reason it's the biggest is because that big chunk of federal funds that go to healthcare. When the state budget writers focus on the decisions that they have to make for the entire balancing the state budget, they're not focusing on everything. They do focus on everything throughout the process of building the long bill and the budget, but when they're thinking about balancing the budget as required by our state constitution, they're focusing on just the general fund. And in fact, when you read in the news, if you read online or on the newspaper or hear about balancing the state budget, the media is talking about the general fund budget because that is the part of the budget that everything balances off of. This is general purpose taxes, mostly sales and income taxes, that the General Assembly gets to decide how to use for general government purposes. And you can see where that money flows to. We still have more than half of our budget being spent on K through 12 education and healthcare, but they have switched places. And even though healthcare is not the biggest share of the general fund budget, it is providing most of the budgetary pressure in a general fund budget right now. I'm going to start out by talking about general fund revenue. So that box in the upper left-hand corner of the slide there that says general fund, what I'm going to do is I'm going to blow that up right now. There it is. And this shows you where that money comes from. 27% this year we expect will come from sales and use taxes, and 63% from individual income taxes combined. That's 90%. And that's really important because that's where a lot of the research on how aging will affect our revenue, our state government revenue, has focused. There is a paper that is actually going to be cited on the bottom of the slide in the next few slides for you that was put together by Allison Felix and Kate Watkins of the Denver branch of the Kansas City Federal Reserve back in 2013. That I'm going to present to you. There was another paper that was written about this that's actually on the Building a Better Colorado website that was put together by the Colorado Future Center at the Colorado State University that goes into this in great detail, not just revenue, but it also goes into expenditures in the state budget, how they model how Medicaid expenditures will change, and talk about some of the other programs in other state departments that are specifically focused on the elderly population. So diving into the paper that Allison Felix and Kate Watkins put together, and just for full disclosure, Kate Watkins is the chief economist for Legislative Council staff. She reports directly to me now, so she no longer works for the Federal Reserve, and she's actually updated a few of these slides for me. Here is an updated slide. Elizabeth was talking to you earlier about how that age group, the age group between the 40s and 50s, spend the most. They also have the highest income. They also earn the highest income, and the growth rate in their spending and their income is the fastest. So this shows you consumer spending on average for 2015 for population cohorts here. And it also shows you some categories of spending. So you have housing, most of which is not taxed for sales and use taxes. Transportation, well, vehicles are taxed, but gasoline is not taxed on the sales tax. It is for the gasoline tax. Food, some of which is taxed. Insurance and pensions, which are not taxed. Healthcare, which is not taxed. Education, which is generally not taxed. And then everything above that are things that in general are stuff and are taxed. As people age, we know that they spend less money on stuff and they spend more money on healthcare and experiences. So that means that per capita sales taxes probably are going to fall as the population ages. Moving from spending into incomes, and thinking about individual income taxes, this shows you that same chart for where the source of your income is. The bulk of that obviously is the light blue, wages and salaries. And then you have self-employment, some interest, dividends, and rents. And the gold is important here because that is where the pensions and retirement income comes in. And you can see as people age into 55 and 65 and older, income falls off quite a bit. Taxable income actually falls off even faster, and that's because a large chunk of that gold bar of the pension income is exempt from both federal and Colorado taxable income. So it would make sense then that taxes also peak for those in their 40s and 50s and drop off fairly quickly thereafter. This chart shows you federal income taxes in the light blue and state and local income taxes in the medium blue. This is on average for the entire United States, so it's not specific to Colorado. But it's important to note that these impacts on revenue are happening not just at the state level, they're happening at the local level, and they're happening at the federal level too. And all of that plays in to how our government is able to provide services and set up their budgets over time. Property taxes are a little bit more stable. They're in the dark blue as many people age in place, but they do fall as people age. So Allison Felix and Kate Watkins said, what if we took revenue, average taxes paid in 2011 and applied it to the age demographic in 2030? If we applied it to age distribution in 2030, how would revenue in 2011 have changed as a result of that change in the age distribution. And they found that both sales taxes and individual income taxes on a per capita basis fell. For sales taxes, and this shows you for every state in the country, for sales taxes, all but one of the states who actually have a sales tax experienced in that model a decrease in per capita sales tax revenue. In Colorado, it was between a drop of 1% and 2%. And I think what's interesting here is that's real. That does mean that we've got a drop in per capita revenue, but it's not enough to mean that overall revenue is going to drop. Revenue overall is going to continue to increase because population growth increases. And another thing is it's pretty small. It's not as big, it's not going to create a budget crisis in any particular year. But it does mean that when combined with what's also going on with expenditures, there is tighter budgets in the next few decades than there were, say, in the 1990s. For income taxes are a little bit more volatile than sales taxes. And in Colorado, we expect that individual income tax revenue would have fallen by 5%. There are a few states in both cases for sales taxes and income taxes where it increased, and that has nothing to do with aging and more to do with the structure of the tax itself. For example, the highlighted blue, those states have, they really only tax capital gains and they don't tax wages. So what does this mean for our general fund revenue? Focusing on general fund revenue for Colorado. And what I've done is I've given you a history. This is a history, it's not looking forward, of per capita inflation adjusted general fund revenue. So adjusted for inflation in 2016 dollars, how much general fund revenue did the state get per person since fiscal year 2001? And I chose that on purpose. 2001 is the beginning of a business cycle. So what we see here are two business cycles. You see the first recession that happened in the turn of the century, and then you see a growth spurt, and then you see another recession. Another thing I think is important to point out is that as we see these long-term trends materialize, where we're going to have per capita revenue falling and expenditure pressures rising over time, the business cycle is overlaid on this. And actually the business cycle is in any one point in time, if you're just looking at where you are, is going to overshadow anything that's going on in the long run trends. So that can muddy the picture as well. But if you look at the long run trend over the last two business cycles, you can see that we have seen a decrease in per capita inflation adjusted general fund revenue. Our forecast for the next 3 years expects it to grow, and that's because the economy is growing fairly well right now, and we are in the late stages of an economic expansion, so we would expect to see that happen. We have not forecast a recession just yet. But over the long run, we would expect to see that downward trend continue if you just trend it and look at the trend rather than just the business cycle. So while the near-term budget situation is rosy, the budgetary pressures will persist over the long term because of the aging population, its impact on revenue. There are a few other things that are going on top of this that are constraining state and local tax structures. They shift to online consumer spending away from brick and mortars. There's an erosion of gas tax revenue with higher fuel efficiency and fixed gas tax rates. And also our state constitution constrains the state budget as well. I've noted the Gallagher Amendment here, which requires the residential assessment rate to fall. And what this basically does is it reduces growth in property taxes over time, both for local governments and also for the local government share of school finance, which affects the state budget. And demand for services will outpace revenue growth as well, especially medical costs. There are a few other places. These are just the low-hanging fruit. State and local pensions, you'll see increased pressure. Healthcare services, we talked about Medicaid, higher insurance premiums for government employees. There's going to be shifts in demands for certain services. Elizabeth did a great job explaining a lot of that. And shifts in support for services as well. We know that older people tend to support spending on education at lower rates. But I think something that's important to keep in mind is that these programs that are specifically focused on the elderly are not the only place that will be affected. that per capita revenue, all else equal, will fall is not the only way that revenue will be affected. Because as Elizabeth pointed out, the aging population will have impacts in every part of our economy. And she pointed out how it will slow our labor force growth. In general, when you look at overall economic growth, the long run expectation for economic growth is the sum of labor force and productivity growth. So if the labor force grows at a slower rate, the economy will grow at a slower rate as well. And that will impact state and local government revenue. In addition to that, there are a lot of government programs that, while they may not focus specifically on the elderly, they serve the elderly. For example, the prison population, our prisons, they do have an aging population as well. And if we talk about healthcare, the cost of healthcare services going up, there's going to be pressure in their budget as well because of the aging population. I'm going to go back to kind of the picture of general fund to give you some context before I go into the next section. This was remember that blue rectangle for revenue that I showed you before for where revenue came from here on the left. And then I've added on the right its corollary. How is the money spent? And so you can see again that the biggest parts of the budget are for healthcare and education. These figures are slightly different from what you saw before because what you saw before was just the operating budget, and this shows you everything. So you see that in this year we are spending 2% of our general fund budget on transportation and capital construction. If I were to show you the same chart for expenditures from 10 years ago, I think you would see that the share of spending on healthcare has gone up by about 7 percentage points, and the share of spending on everything else has gone down. So we have already seen, even though we're only partially through the aging of the population, the healthcare department, health Medicaid basically crowd out some spending in other parts of the state budget. I'm going to, the next set of slides that I'm going to do kind of looks at, over the last 2 business cycles, how has growth in the state, in general fund revenue and general fund appropriations compared with, say, inflation plus population growth and growth in other parts of the general fund budget. So this indexes growth. You basically see cumulative growth here, starting again at the beginning of that business cycle. This is the last 2 business cycles in fiscal year 2001. Since then, inflation and population growth has basically doubled. So it's grown 100%. And then general fund appropriations have almost doubled. So it's pretty much kept track. General fund revenue is growing slower. We've talked about that already. The State Sheriff's School Finance has crowded out some other parts of the general fund budget. And a lot of the reason for that has to do with our Constitution, and that's a subject for another day, so I won't talk about that. But what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about healthcare, which is the biggest, is creating the biggest pressure in our general fund. So this shows you, the gray lines show you growth over this period in total appropriations to the Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing, which houses the Medicaid program, and then also growth in the Medicaid caseload. And I think it's important to point out that this is not the entire Medicaid caseload. This chart is talking about pressures on the general fund budget. So it's excluding a bunch of people in 2014 and later that were added to the Medicaid caseload as a result of the Affordable Care Act. Now, Colorado expanded Medicaid in 2009, and you can see that that contributed to some growth between 2009 and 2014 in the Medicaid caseload. The Medicaid caseload has grown 256%. It has more than tripled. And we have the healthcare policy and financing appropriations also growing much faster than the rest of the budget. So what happened, though, to overall Medicaid? Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. This shows you Medicaid caseload, but it shows all of Medicaid caseload. And so what we see here is all of Medicaid caseload continued to grow after 2014 because of the expansion in the Affordable Care Act. And it all shows up there in the adults without children, which is the darker blue area. But if you focus on the very top line, the adults 65 and older, which was 6% of enrollment in 2015, it was already growing at that point in time. The next slide looks a lot like this, but it's spending. So you can compare the share of enrollment, share of caseload with overall spending, how much these populations cost compared to other populations. And you can see that even though adults 65 and older were only 6% of the population, they cost 20% of the spending. And this trend has continued since then, and we expect the trend to continue in the future, that not only will the share of population grow for adults 65 and older, but the costs will grow because costs for serving the older population are growing faster than costs for serving, say, children. So this is going to crowd out spending in other parts of the state budget. This is the same chart that we looked at before. What I'm going to do to talk about how it's crowded out some things in the past and how we expect it could crowd out the other things in the future is talk about higher education. So that's not about the elderly, right? But it is affected by the elderly because in the future, when we expect to see Medicaid continuing to add pressure to the budget and revenue not growing as quickly as it was before, we expect to see some crowding out. And it has happened. If you look at the bottom line, general fund appropriations increased only 18% over this time. What happened was there wasn't enough general fund to pay for higher education, so it got refinanced. Resident and non-resident tuition revenue both around quadrupled during that time period. Another thing that's crowded out, this shows you revenue to the Highway Users Tax Fund, which is where your gas tax and your vehicle registration fees go in order to be doled out to the Department of Transportation at the state and local governments for transportation, highways and roads funding. That's not growing as fast either. And you know, it's an entirely different subject. We could talk for another day about transportation funding and infrastructure funding. So that's another thing that gets crowded out. In conclusion, what does AG mean for state budgets? Tighter budgets over time. It's not going to bankrupt the state in any one year, but over time we're going to have slower growing revenue and faster growing services, not just because of faster caseload in programs like Medicaid, but also because costs are rising as well. All on the margin. It is happening and it is being felt by our budget writers, but it's on the margin. And you're still going to have to deal with the recessions, unfortunately, and you're still going to get years like we have now where we have extra money to spend to deal with other priorities like para and pensions and those kinds of things. That concludes my presentation. I think we're ready for questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Natalie. Brian, what questions are we taking? Question for Elizabeth. Yep, sorry. Do you have any data on number of seniors coming from other states to be with family, etc.?
Yeah, so can you hear me? Okay. So yeah, we do get information on migration patterns by state, and it's very similar to what we see for the state population as a whole, but definitely a larger number coming from California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, and then we also get a relationship with Minnesota. So those are the prime areas, but again, it's interesting. It's still the net numbers are very close to zero, even for this decade.
Okay, I would tack on to that, Elizabeth. I saw a headline in today's paper that the governor of Vermont signed a bill yesterday awarding $10,000 to anyone who would move to Vermont and agree to work online for an out-of-state company because they too have an aging population and have a real concern how it's going to impact. Any comment from either of you about that? Is that
I think it's going to be something that we're going to need to start looking at. Again, it's interesting the way Natalie portrayed stuff. It's like on the margin today, there might not be a large impact, but look at the cumulative effect, and in 20 years from now, could we be at the same situation? Maybe. And so I think that there are going to be needing some encouragement for young adults sometimes to move to places.
okay? Next question. Affordable senior appropriate housing is an issue. Yes, it is. Any comments
I was going to
about
say
that?
affordable housing across the spectrum is a challenge. And so certainly senior housing is going to be in that realm as well. And I think there's a lot of people looking at those issues. We know that a lot of private companies have put together market and above market rate for housing for seniors, but it's at that affordable level that we don't see people. But what's really interesting is that most people age in place. So 80% of the households over 65 are still living on their own, which is interesting.
Okay. Next question. Have you quantified the overall payroll impact where entrants are earning less than retirees leaving?
So yeah, I think a lot of different people have looked at that, and it's something that Natalie touched on a little bit, but I think that's why we're seeing this downward pressure in wages, and why we haven't seen that increase in wages, because we do have that. We have people that are at the higher incomes aging out and retiring, and then you've got the newbie coming in that comes in typically at a lower wage rate. And so that's why I think why you've seen a flat in Colorado and flat across the U.S. I don't know if Natalie, maybe you have another perspective.
Absolutely, that is a big part of it. There's other things that have affected the slow growth in wages that you would expect to see. We've had relatively tame inflation, and generally the higher inflation is the higher wages tend to be. We've also had really slow growth in productivity. Productivity continues to grow, but it's not growing as fast as it has in prior expansions. And if somebody's going to produce more stuff in every hour, you're more willing to give them more money. But since productivity growth hasn't been as fast, wage growth also hasn't been as fast. But definitely the retirees and younger people coming in has already had an impact as well. That's why looking at the average wage, which is how a lot of the media reports it, can be misleading.
Okay. Another question from Miller. What is the potential gain to revenues if the state and if the sales and use tax were extended to services?
Well, I think that if it was extended to services, we would see a growth in revenue. I don't know that number off the top of my head. However, growth in spending on services isn't going to grow. It's going to grow faster than growth in spending on stuff over time. But a lot of the growth is happening in healthcare, and there's not a lot of political will to tax healthcare.
Okay. And then Karen has a question. What percent of the budget constraint is due to healthcare increases versus reductions in revenue? And I have a follow-up question in regards to that. I'm curious, what impact is it's been suggested that if we were to reverse the expansion population and roll that back, that might help our general fund?
Well, I actually know the answer to that. We did a member of my staff did some research on how to reverse that increase in eligibility and what that would mean for the budget recently. And I think it would mean that expenditures would go down by, if my memory serves, like $2.3 billion, but we'd also lose $2.2 billion in federal revenue to pay for those expenditures. So because so much of the expansion right now is being paid for by the federal government, it wouldn't have as big of an impact on our general fund as one might think. And as far as what percentage of the additional pressure is caused by increase in Medicaid versus falling per capita revenue, I think that we don't really know that yet. What's going on with the business cycle and everything else that clouds that means that you have to model that. If you want to look at a model for that, I would look at the work that Allison Felix and Kate Watkins has done for revenue, and for both revenue and Medicaid expenditures that was done by the Colorado Future Centers that's on the BBCO website.
Okay, we're going to do one more question. Do you have numbers, estimates of the Gallagher Amendment's impact on property tax revenue from the over 65 crowd, separate from the homestead tax exemption, from Bob?
No, we don't have any estimates specifically to folks who are older than 65. I think that we could model that. If you're interested in that, give me a call. My contact information is available, but we haven't looked at that specifically. Okay.
All right, Brian. I think that is all of the questions we're going to take right now, because we promised people we would be out of here in an hour, and it is an hour right now. I would invite people to take just 60 seconds and complete the very brief survey that you're going to see on your screen as soon as we close the webinar, and give us a little feedback on how we can improve this in the future. Would also encourage people to visit our website and click on that participate page to allow you to be considered for not only the community meetings we'll be hosting next year, but also to get notice of webinars. Our intent is to do several more of these webinars to touch on some of the topics that we touched on today, including transportation funding, K-12 funding, and the Gallagher Amendment as well. So, with that, I want to thank everybody again for joining us. I want to give special thanks to our two guests, Natalie Mullis and Elizabeth Garner, for their time. The state is blessed to have both of them working for us. And thank Brian as well for keeping me from jumping out the window here. Thank you all for your time today. Have a great day and a great summer. Goodbye.